Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are starting Unit 3, which is the Sensation and Perception unit. This one's a little bit shorter, so it'll only take about like a week or so. But it's kind of a good place to leave off from Unit 2, because Unit 2 is biology, and we talked about things like the thalamus and how our senses take a pit stop there, and then how they get processed often in the different lobes of the brain. So this will kind of build off some of that stuff. So let's get into it. First thing though, I enjoy this unit because it kind of challenges how we think a little bit. It makes you kind of be like, ooh, everything isn't as it seemed, like the Wizards of Waverly Place theme song says. Because oftentimes, as we see in this unit, we're going to see that sometimes how we perceive or interpret sensory information might actually be different than what's going on in the real world, which kind of is a little trippy. It makes you think about things. So let's get started. Today we're just covering the basics of what is sensation, what is perception, and then we'll get into the specific senses of like vision, hearing, etc. in the coming days. All right. So first we got to tackle like what are the definitions of sensation and perception, and how are these different? So sensation is just the act of picking up and collecting your sensory info, depending on what it is, right? If it's touch, it's going to go in through your hands or whatever it is. If it's sight, it's going to go in through your eyes. If it's hearing, obviously your ears, right? It's the act of collecting that information from the world and getting it into your body. Then, before we get to perception, we have to do something called transduction. And I would star this word a bunch because it's really important. So, transduction is basically taking the senses from the real world and turning it into a brain language, so you can understand, like your brain can understand it and process it, right? Because like if we touch something, if we taste something, right, those have to be changed so they can be formatted in a way that our brain understands them. You can think of this as like a computer analogy, right? So if you are typing on your computer, you're typing in letters, but then that's going to change into a code that your computer can understand, right? So that's kind of what transduction is changing it from the words you're typing on your Google Doc into the code that your computer now understands. So that's transduction, official thing, transforming sensory energy into neural impulses, the brain language that your brain now understands to perceive it and understand it. So perception is the actual process of like understanding and giving meaning to what we're sensing in the world, whether it be vision, touch, taste, hearing, whatever. So this is actually where now it's in our brain language, and we're going to process and think about what we're seeing, hearing, whatever, and then connect it to what we already know and memories, right? So you're smelling some kind of cookie, and you're like, this smells like my grandma's cookies, yay. Right? You're going to connect it to personal things. Or you're seeing something, and you're going to process like, who is it that I see? There's a person. Oh, it's my buddy Joe, right? So perception is the process of actually interpreting what you're seeing, hearing, or sensing, whatever, and giving meaning to it. So, like I said, transduction is a really important term. So let's go over the steps of how we take sensory information and convert it into neural impulses or brain language for our brain to process and interpret it. So, first off, you're going to receive the sensory stimulation, right? So we talk about like afferent or the afferent neurons or sensory neurons. Oh my gosh, I couldn't think of the word. Afferent or sensory neurons, right? It's going to get picked up. So we're going to receive them, whether it's vision coming in or touch sensation. Then that's going to be transformed into neural impulses. And then this neural impulse is now going to be delivered to the brain to be organized and sent to the appropriate part for processing. Right? So we know that for everything except smell, it's going to take a pit stop in the thalamus to be sorted and organized and then sent to the appropriate official brain part to be further processed, which we know is probably one of those lobes, right? We have occipital lobe for vision, we have temporal lobe for hearing, etc. So, right, just picking it up, the sensation, converting it into a neural impulse. We talk about those sensory neurons, etc. Send it up to the thalamus, most likely, and then to the appropriate lobe for processing. So really, we talk about sensation. We've kind of hit the big stuff. What we're focusing on a lot of Unit 3 is how do we process and interpret or perceive perception, the world around us. And do we all perceive the world the same way? Like I said, this unit's a little trippy, so it might make you kind of, question, rethink some things, right? I don't know if you guys remember, this was when I was in high school. I think I was a senior in high school when this became viral. So we have the dress. Is it blue or black, or I think it's white and gold is the other option. I personally see blue and black, but maybe it's different for y'all. So, again, this is an example of how what we perceive from our sensations might differ amongst other people, right? And how we perceive the world might not be what it actually is out there in the world. Same thing if you listen to this video. Some people hear the word Yanni when they say it, and then other people hear the word Laurel. Um, Again, there's just a split amongst the population, and you see this is a great example of how, obviously we're picking up the same sensations, but how we're perceiving them in our mind, once that's converted into brain language, whatever, is going to differ amongst people. So it's really kind of making you think that, again, our perception of the world might be different than the person next to us. Right? So we could all be looking at the same thing, but how we perceive them could be different. So I want you to look at this video here. Let's press play.
Then there's the Ratman illusion. Try to identify each drawing as soon as you see it. Now, identify this one. Let's try another sequence. Again, identify each drawing as soon as you see it. Now, how about this one? In a number of studies, it was found that the first series of drawings of animals led most subjects to identify this image as a rat. But when other subjects saw the drawings of people, they tended to identify this drawing as an old man with glasses.
Right, so you probably were much more likely in looking at the Ratman illusion to see it as the first time, if you saw the animals before, you were much more likely to see it as a rat because you were primed with a bunch of animals before. If you saw all the people and their faces before you saw the Ratman illusion, you're probably more likely to see it as an old man. And this illustrates really well this concept of perceptual set. And it's the idea that our experiences and what we already know and that's in our mind is what influence how we perceive things and think about things. So again, if you were primed or already had in your mind the experiences of seeing all those animals, you're more likely to see and perceive this as a rat. If you were already had these experiences of seeing people and were primed with that in your mind, you're more likely to perceive it as a human. So perceptual set, again, is just this idea that sometimes we're more primed or predisposed to perceive one thing or another, and this is due to our past experiences and what we already know. A good example of this is like, how the Ocon O is really similar to, is it the Oregon O? I don't know. Right? One of the sport teams. So if you were like walking around and you saw, like, maybe you're just in another state, right? So, and you see something and it's the O, you're probably way more likely to perceive that as the Ocon O than the Oregon O, right? And that's just because of what we already have in our minds that we know, right? It's our perceptual set. That's how we're going to perceive that. So, perceptual set is kind of based off of this concept that we have two modes of processing sensory information. So, we have bottom up processing and top down processing. Top down processing is what perceptual set uses, where you are taking in sensory info and then you're comparing it against the models, ideas, expectations, memories, and things that you already have in your mind to process it. And it's kind of a speedy way of processing things, right? It's easier for us to like look at something and be like, that's the Ocon O, right? Like I know that, I've seen that. right? Like, ooh, that looks like a rat because I saw a bunch of animals, right? You're kind of like comparing it with what you already know, and it helps speed up processing. Then, on the other hand, we have bottom up processing. And this is where you take in sensory information like piece by piece and interpret it kind of just for what it is. You're not comparing it to reference something that's already in your brain that you know. You're just taking it in bit by bit and assembling and integrating it together. So, this is a much slower process, right? You're not comparing it to things that you already know, things in your mind. You're just kind of like seeing it at face value for what it is. You're not really comparing it to something that you already know. So maybe bottom up is a little more accurate in that you're not like, what's the word, being like a little biased or like colored by something that you already know. But obviously, top down is good because you are using things you already know, and it kind of speeds up the processing of information and perceiving things. So again, bottom up is focusing on just the sensory info itself at face value. Top down is taking in the sensory info and then also considering the context in which you are getting it and comparing it to things you already know. So Ratman is very much top down processing. So here's another image, and we can practice using bottom up versus top down processing. So using bottom up, I'm going to ask you guys to explain what you see. And if I were using bottom up, I would just say kind of like all the things that are making up the image. So like, okay, there's a horse, there's a tree, there's some rocks. Looks like smaller rocks, bigger rocks, whatever. Right. So you're just kind of taking it in for what it is and not really like comparing it to what you know. If I were using top down processing to explain this image, um, I'd be looking at the title. Oh, the forest has eyes, right? I didn't tell you the title when I asked you this time. The title here is The Forest Has Eyes. So now I'm have a mental set or a perceptual set to think about, okay, eyes. I'm going to be looking for things about eyes. Okay, ooh, this is a face. Look at this face. I see a bunch of, right, one face, two face, three, four, all these faces, right? And that's because I had the perceptual set or was primed with this idea that the forest have eyes. So I'm looking for them. So that's what your perceptual set is. It's like kind of priming you with being exposed or things that you already know to see things in a certain way, right? It's you have a mental predisposition to be more likely to perceive one thing and not another. And when I'm have that uh, predisposition or I'm primed with the idea that the forest has eyes, I'm much more likely to see the faces in this time looking at the photo. Okay. And here's another good example of this. It's almost kind of tied in with confirmation bias in a way, but I ask students to listen to Stairway to Heaven in reverse. And I ask you guys to write down what you hear when it's played backwards in reverse. Usually, it's not what it is when I tell you the lyrics of what people made up for when it's backwards. Usually, you guys just come up with your own thing. But what happens then is when I give it first, these lyrics of, hey, listen for these lyrics when you listen to it backwards. It's all these things. So people would mask music back in the day, and this is how the whole rock and roll is evil and like satanic thing came about, because they would be like, oh, there's like satanic messages when you play it backwards. So here's what people claim they heard when you play Led Zeppelin Stairway to Heaven in reverse, right? Oh, here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path made me so sad, whose power is Satan. Then, if I had you read this first, then listen to the song being played in reverse, you're much more likely to write down that you heard these things than you would if you just listened to it without knowing that this is how people interpreted it. So again, that is perceptual set, right? You can be kind of influenced to perceive things a certain way depending on what you're exposed to. All right. So now, if you think about it, and I've talked about this before, we have so many different sensations going on at one moment in time. We have more than five senses too that I'm going to talk about. But if you just think about it, all the things that are happening that our senses are registering, it's incredible and it's wild. And if we actually were aware and conscious of all these different senses going on, we'd never be able to pay attention to anything because there's so much going on in terms of taste, smell, vision, hearing, whatever. So here we go. Our five senses take in 11 million bits of info per second, but we only consciously process about 40 bits of this info. And the reason we're able to focus and not be distracted by all the bajillions of little things that are going on in our senses at once is because of a term called selective attention, right? So you can see here, this image represents that. And like, if you think about it, this girl's reading her book and focusing on it, but there's a dog barking, there's probably wind wisping around, there's noise in the background, there's a guy talking, even just like your touch, right? Like you are sitting here, you're not aware of the clothes, you're not aware of the chair you're sitting on, you're not aware of all these things. Now that I said it, you'll be aware of it. But right, we're able to have selective attention in which we block out a lot of these senses to focus on what we're actually wanting to perceive and pay attention to. A specific form of of selective attention is called the cocktail party effect, and this is a good vocab term to know. And it's just more specific in terms of selective attention in that it's when you're in an area where there's a lot of noise and you're able to focus in on one voice amongst the noise. So they call it the cocktail party effect, and that like if you're at a cocktail hour at the wedding or something, there's tons of people talking, it's really loud and noisy, but you're able to focus in on what one person in your conversation is and just listen to them and tune out all the other stuff. So cocktail party effect is a form of selective attention where you can just listen to one and focus on one voice in conversation among a sea of a bunch of other voices and noise. Now here's another video we can watch.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So hopefully you guys noticed the moonwalking bear, but in this research, we see that a lot of people don't notice the moonwalking bear. And this is kind of because of selective attention, right? You are focusing your attention. You were told to look for the team in white and how many times they're passing the ball. So you're really, really fixated on the ball and watching that. And again, because of your selective attention, you're really good at focusing on that, but you miss out on some other really important things. So even though we process a lot of things at once, we are able to focus in on stuff, but also we're not great multitaskers too because of that, and we do miss out on things. So selective attention is good, but also can cause some problems. And what we see here is a term called inattentional blindness. So this is where we fail to see visible objects when our attention is directed elsewhere. So again, selective attention, a good thing. But sometimes we run into problems when we're too focused on something and we miss out on other things. So that's inattentional blindness, failing to see visible things that are actually in our active stream of vision, but we don't actually register them because our attention's directed elsewhere. Another term that shows the problem of selective attention is change blindness. And this is when we fail to notice changes in our environment. So a good one is, I've seen lots of examples of this where I've seen it at Cracker Barrel too, where like a bunch of people come in and they take black and white photos of themselves and put them on the wall at Cracker Barrel and see if people notice. But we see here, this is one where they've been secretly changing out their parents' family photos with Tiger King photos. And it's been 9 days and their parents haven't noticed yet. So this is change blindness, where you're failing to notice changes in your environment. Now, the difference between these two, because they seem similar, they're both issues that arise with selective attention. But inattentional blindness is when we're not noticing something actively in our field of vision, like what you're actively seeing, because you're paying attention to something else. So that's why the moonwalking bear is a good example. change blindness is where we fail to notice a change in our environment. So it doesn't mean that it's something that's actively happening in front of you in your vision, but it's something in your daily environment that you fail to notice. So another example of this is like I think there was a newscaster and he wore the same suit like for a year and no one noticed. He was trying to make a point about like how like people notice what women wear and not men, I think. So that's an example, right? Because it's like an environment, something you're seeing every day, but it's not something that's like actively in your stream of vision that like changed. And same thing, that's why the Tiger King photos is a good example of this because it's not necessarily something that's changing right in front of you in your stream of vision, but it's something that is changing in your environment that you're seeing daily that you're just not picking up on. So that's the difference between these two. Now we also have something called sensory adaptation because again, we have bajillions of senses coming in at once. And if we were all hyper aware of all these different senses, like, right, we'd be overstimulated. So sensory adaptation is a really good thing for us. So sensory adaptation is stimulus detectors that announce changes in our world. And the longer we are exposed to stimulation, the lower our sensitivity is to it. And what we mean by stimulation just means like a sound, a sight, a touch sensation. So any kind of like sensation of like touch, taste, vision, whatever. Um, so the longer we're exposed to something, the less aware we are of it, and the less sensitive we get to it. So an example is a really good one is like jumping into a pool, right? As soon as it happens, we're really sensitive to it and very aware of how cold it is. And then we adapt and we adjust. So the longer we're in the pool, the more used to it we get, right? The sensitivity goes down. Same thing of like smells too. I know this happened to me when I worked at Culver's. I remember the everything smelled so good and I was always so hungry. But then over time, I got used to it and adapted, and I was like less aware of all the smells of all the food all the time. Except there were some things that still always smelled good, like the waffle cones that were homemade. But for the most part, I kind of adapted to that because I was exposed to it all the time. Another thing is like if you go in somewhere that like smells really bad, right? Like a Barfarama explosion, um, smells really bad at first, but then as you're cleaning it up, right, it might kind of get used to it a little bit. And this is the same thing too. Like it's good because it allows us to ignore the obvious and not waste time, right? So maybe you notice a ceiling fan in the background, but the longer it's on, you're going to move on and be less aware of it and less sensitive to that noise. So that's sensory adaptation. So that's what allows you guys to listen to me blabber on and focus on what I'm doing and not focus on the feeling of your chair or the fan or the lights or whatever, right? Because you're used to that. So you can kind of, thanks to selective attention and sensory adaptation, focus on what you need to. Now, one of the other really important terms to know is something called absolute threshold. And this is the minimum amount of stimulation, again, meaning like a sensation that we register, needed to detect a particular sensory stimulus 50% of the time. So a really good example of this is like a hearing test, if you've ever done that, where it has the little beeps that it give you. And it might start off louder and then get quieter and quieter and quieter. And what they're doing with the hearing test is they're trying to figure out what the minimum amount of stimulation is, meaning like noise, in this case for hearing, right? What the minimum amount of sound is needed for you to detect that 50% of the time, right? What's the minimum amount of stimulation for you to detect it correctly 50% of the time? So if you think about the hearing test, right, as it gets quieter and quieter and quieter, they'd say that your absolute threshold is the point, like the last point where you can correctly identify a sound that's probably really quiet at least 50% of the time correctly. Once you go below your absolute threshold, you're probably not able to hear it, or at least hear it correctly 50% of the time. Same thing with a vision test, right? You go to the eye doctor, I have that poster in my room, all the words, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Your absolute threshold for vision would be if you are able to correctly identify a letter on there at least 50% of the time, right? So they're going to go through bigger to smaller, And then the absolute threshold would be that point where you get to a letter that's probably pretty small, and it's the one that you can identify 50% of the time. And then below that, you're not able to really recognize those correctly. They're too small. You can't pick it up and register it correctly 50% of the time. So we have absolute thresholds for all our senses. So you can think like vision, maybe it's seeing a candle flame 30 miles on a dark, clear night, right? That's like the minimum amount that you could see, right? After at 31 miles, it's too light, you can't pick it up, right? Hearing the tick of a watch under quiet conditions and it's 20 feet away from you, right? If it was 21 feet away, maybe you wouldn't hear it, right? That's like the minimum amount of stimulation needed for you to be able to pick it up correctly. Taste is a good example, right? Like, oh, I could recognize 1 teaspoon of sugar and 2 gallons of water, right? At what point would you notice there's sugar in it, right? How much sugar is needed for you to recognize that there's sugar in this water? Okay. Then we hit something called the just noticeable difference. So now, absolute threshold was just you being able to kind of identify something correctly 50% of the time. So, what's the minimal amount of a sound or something visual that you can correctly identify 50%? JND, just noticeable difference, also called difference threshold, is you being able to tell the difference between two stimuli. We got a kitty. We got a kitty. Oh my gosh, kitty. You being able to correctly identify the difference between two stimuli at least 50% of the time. So I think hearing is a really good example of this. So, for example, if you had the volume up in your car radio and it's like you start it at level 38 and then you turn it to 39, are you going to notice if you were like, not looking at it, are you going to notice the difference if your friend turned it from 38 to 39? Probably not, right? That's not in your just noticeable difference threshold. But if you turned it, maybe you're not looking, your friend is changing it from the volume from 38 to 48. Now you might register like, oh, that's kind of loud. They turned it up a little bit, right? So just noticeable difference is the point where you can recognize that there is a difference between two things. So another example of that is like if you're at the gym and you're doing weights, right? So like, are you going to notice the difference between a 5 and if you're, blindfolded or something, are you going to notice the difference between a 5 and a 6 pound weight? Maybe. If you're doing a like 50 pounds and then you add 50, another pound, it's 51 pounds. Are you going to notice the difference between that? Probably not, right? But then if you added another 15 pounds to that, right, maybe you would be much more aware of that difference. So just noticeable difference again, you being able to notice the difference between two things at least 50% of the time. If you aren't able to notice the difference between a 5 pound and a 6 pound weight, then it's not in your difference threshold. A law that goes around just noticeable difference is called the Weber's Law. Now this says that the just noticeable difference is big when the intensity is high. And then the just noticeable difference is small when the intensity is low. Basically meaning, kind of like going back to our weight example, I think is a good one, that when you have a really high intensity, meaning like, let's say you are already at like 100 pounds that you're lifting. If you were to put like 1 more pound on, you're not going to notice a difference because the intensity is already really high. Like, what's 1 pound more going to do? But when the intensity is low, like you going from like a 5, so let's say you did 100-pound weight, you're benching, and then you add on 5 pounds, and now it's 105 pounds, right? You're probably not going to notice the difference. If you were just doing some little curls with a 5-pound dumbbell and then you made it a 10-pound dumbbell, you're way more likely to notice and recognize that there's a difference going on and that it's heavier. So that's what this says. When the intensity is high, meaning like now you're lifting like really heavy weights already, you're not really likely to notice a difference. It's going to take more for you to notice a difference, right? You're going to have to add on like 15 pounds at your 100 pounds to notice that difference. But then when the just noticeable difference is small, or when the intensity is small or low, the just noticeable difference is smaller. So right, you don't need as much to be able to notice a difference. So if you had 5 pounds, 5 pound weight, and then you add like even just like a pound or two, at least for me, right, I would be able to pick up the difference pretty quickly by just adding on like a pound or two. Now let's do it with the example of listening to the radio. So, right, if the volume is at already like blaring loud, right, it's like super loud, you're at 38, and then you go to like a 45, you might not even notice that difference because it's already so loud. But think about if you are really soft, like you start it at like a 5 and then you go up to 10, you're going to notice that difference pretty quickly, right? So that's what Weber's law is saying. When the intensity is already really high, meaning something's really loud or the weight's really heavy, whatever, it's going to take more of a change for you to notice that difference. When the intensity is low, it's going to take way less of a change for you to be sensitive and aware of that difference. Now, this is a good video that kind of makes sense of all these concepts we just talked about in terms of like absolute threshold, difference threshold, yada yada. So I'd recommend watching that. Now, one last term I'm going to talk about is signal detection theory. And this says that actually there's no one absolute threshold for everybody, that it's going to depend on two things, actually, if we're going to detect a stimulus and register it. So first, it depends on the intensity of the stimulus. So, right, how loud something is, how heavy something is, how far away something is, if we can see it. And then the second thing it's going to rely on is kind of like we talk about with top-down processing. Your physical and psychological state. So your past experiences with like maybe the things you're picking up and sensing, your expectations, your motives, your alertness, right? Are you sleepy or are you like very focused, right? So taking into consideration the context and like your state of mind. So signal detection theory, a good example of this is that you're way more likely to hear your phone ring at a crowded party that's really noisy if you're already expecting a call. Like you know that your mom's going to be calling you, or you know you're expecting a call from like someone at work or something and you're looking out for that, right? If you versus another person who has no expectation of a call are going to be very different, right? The person not expecting that call isn't on the lookout for it, so they probably wouldn't notice their phone, versus you being on the lookout are much more likely to notice your phone. So again, this is signal detection theory. Another example is like you're walking home at night, or oh my gosh, I just watched that show, The Woman Across the Street from the blah, 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 right? So she's like hearing crazy things in the attic, and she's way more primed to be hearing that because she had her child die and had all these terrible things happen and is like paranoid, right? But if you're just like a typical regular person and you're just chilling there, like you're not going to be on alert to hear those noises as much, right? Like they might exist, whatever noise it is from the attic, but you might not notice it because you're not all like paranoid and like in this state where you're kind of trying to hear those things. So that's signal detection in theory. Right? And here we go. Here's an image. And I said, try and spot the leopard. Now, using signal detection theory, you're probably going to be having an easier job of spotting the leopard than if I didn't tell you there was a leopard there. It's still really hard though, right? I think it's actually like over here. Oh yeah, there it is. Well, like I don't think anyone would get that if they didn't know there was a leopard in the photo. But right, I primed you, signal detection theory. The intensity of the stimulus is really low, but because I did number 2 and kind of set your experience up, you're more likely to perceive that and have it meet your absolute threshold in this case. One last term is subliminal messaging. And we hear about this sometimes with like, oh, like advertisers are putting products in the TV shows we watch and things like that to try and advertise. Subliminal messaging doesn't really work though. There were like bad studies that actually said it did, but what we know is actually it's not very effective. because if something is subliminal, it just means that it falls below your absolute threshold. So you're not able to detect it 50% of the time, right? So it's the stuff in the hearing test that, like, the beeps that you can't correctly identify at least 50% of the time. It's the words or the letters on the vision test that you can't correctly identify 50% of the time. So the thought behind this was like, oh, advertisers are going to put things in where like we can barely register them, but they're going to like somehow get in our unconscious. It's like kind of Freudian, get in our unconscious and like influence our buying decisions and be like, I saw Coca-Cola for like 2 seconds on this show that I watched. Now I'm going to like be unconsciously wanting like Coca-Cola. Um, so yeah, maybe it could prime our decisions for later, and that like maybe we did pick up something of it and it's in our mind, but it doesn't really necessarily affect our behavior because it's subliminal, meaning we can't detect it. It's not in our absolute threshold. This is a good video from The Simpsons that you can listen to. So that's mainly all I have for you. So that's just kind of the basics of sensation and perception. Then we're going to get into in future days what actually like vision, how that works, hearing, how that works, and then some of our other senses like vestibular, taste, etc. All right. Have a nice day.